Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our June 19th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and this episode features 3 guests. First, we'll introduce you to Dr. Christopher Pudenz, who has hit the ground running as Iowa Farm Bureau's new economics and research manager, and already has some interesting nuggets to share with us about topics like California's Prop 12 implementation, African swine fever, and a market study tour of England and Scotland that actually just got started this past weekend. After that, we'll bring on 2 central Iowa farmers, Jeremy Gustafson of Boone County and Doug Adams of Humboldt County, who were featured for their conservation and soil health expertise at Iowa State University's recent Soil Management and Land Valuation Conference. Let's start with Farm Bureau's new economist, Dr. Christopher Pudenz, who had a chance to sit down with spokesman editor Tom Block earlier this month.
To start things off, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background and what you'll be doing in your role as Iowa Farm Bureau Economics and Research Manager?
Yes, thank you, Tom. I started back in April, and I currently reside in the Des Moines Metro with my wife, Grace. Just a little bit of background. I grew up on a multi-generational corn and cattle farm in Carroll County in western Iowa. It's a classic so-called farmer feeder operation where my parents will buy calves and feeder cattle. They'll feed them a high-energy grain ration, and they reach a slaughter weight, at which point we send them off to be harvested. My family has been in the cattle business for a while. My grandfather used to take, somewhat weekly drives down to Kansas City when the stockyards were still operating down there. So they've been in the cattle business for quite some time. Some things have changed. You don't have the weekly trips to Kansas City anymore. And more recently, my parents have raised more soybeans in response to fertilizer prices, mixing a rotation there. But the core of the operation is still the same. We raise corn and we feed it to the cattle. I studied economics at Hillsdale College out in Michigan before attending Iowa State University for a PhD in economics. My research focus was agricultural economics. Specifically, I studied livestock economics under Iowa State's livestock economist Lee Schultz. Great researcher there. I defended my dissertation this spring and graduated in May. Regarding my role and responsibilities as economics and research manager here at Iowa Farm Bureau, I wear a couple different hats. First, as the name suggests, I manage the internal economics research for the Iowa Farm Bureau. Second, my heavy lift for the year is organizing Iowa Farm Bureau's annual market study tour. I think we'll hear more about this in a little bit. But this year we're going to England and Scotland. And then finally, I manage Iowa Farm Bureau's relationships with various export groups that the Iowa Farm Bureau is a member of, such as the U.S. Meat Export Federation, the U.S. Grains Council, and the U.S. Soy Export Council, among others that Iowa Farm Bureau is a member of. All told, I find the role to be a nice blend of research and practical application, really boots on the ground things. And I'm excited to grow in this role and really learn how I can serve Iowa Farm Bureau membership as best as I can as I round out my skill set for this role specifically.
Yeah, and you mentioned you've been on staff now for a couple of months, and a few weeks ago you attended the U.S. Meat Export Federation Conference. For anyone who doesn't know, can you give us a brief description of what the USMEF does and share some of your key takeaways from the conference?
As a very high-level 100,000-foot view description, the USMEF's mission as an organization is to increase the value of U.S. beef, pork, and lamb, and then to subsequently, that'll lead to increases in profit opportunities for the respective industries and also allied industries. You can think of the grains industries of the United States, raised products that are consumed by cattle, swine, and sheep. And by increasing the value of the downstream product, that is good for those grain industries as well. Their primary way of increasing value and increasing profits is to work with stakeholders internationally to enhance demand in export markets. So the USMEF carries out market development activities in more than 80 countries around the world. And these activities include promoting U.S. products, bringing buyers and sellers of U.S. red meat products together and kind of facilitating those interactions, and then also developing and maintaining market access for U.S. products abroad. This has implications for Iowa farmers who raise this protein directly, but also, as I've said, this has implications for Iowa farmers who raise feedstock for these animals. Two key issues I heard about over and over at this conference were African swine fever, or ASF, and Proposition 12, or Prop 12. So I'll handle those one at a time. In regard to African swine fever, or ASF, there is lingering, if not heightened, concern that the U.S. swine herd could get the disease. We've never had it before. We want to keep it that way. The U.S. government is exerting lots of resources to make sure that we don't get this disease. But if we do get this disease, the swine herd implications are absolutely devastating. China got the disease in 2018, and according to who you talk to, the herd still hasn't recovered. And so this would be absolutely devastating for the swine herd in terms of animal health and animal numbers, but also would have major trade implications. And this was kind of the focus of the USMEF's discussion on it. If we were to get a case of ASF in the United States, many of our most important trading partners would likely cease to accept our pork products for an indefinite period of time. Without going too much into the weeds, my takeaway from the meeting is that there has been substantial progress made in securing agreements ahead of time, so pre any potential outbreak in the United States. So there have been these agreements that have been secured ahead of time from key trading partners internationally regarding what their reaction would be should we get a case of ASF in Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands. So those are islands in the Caribbean that are part of the United States technically, but they aren't the mainland United States. But the reason those have kind of been singled out is because they're close to islands in the Caribbean, particularly the Dominican Republic, that have had cases of African swine fever. So U.S. government officials have worked very hard with trading partners to say, hey, if one of the islands that is, part of the United States there in the Caribbean were to have a case of African swine fever, will you still continue to take product from the mainland United States? And it seems to be that there's a lot of progress there, and a lot of countries have signed on and said either, without conditions or with conditions that they would continue to do that. That said, should an outbreak occur in the continental United States, say, heaven forbid, should an outbreak occur in Iowa or something like that, that's a completely different story, and there's a long way to go to prepare for that and to prepare for the potential trade fallout should that happen. Switching gears a little bit in regard to Proposition 12, obviously Iowa Farm Bureau was pretty disappointed with the outcome of that 5-4 Supreme Court decision handed down in May. And just for those who may not be familiar, Proposition 12, or Prop 12, is a law approved by voters in California that dictates what practices can and cannot be used in the production of veal, pork, and eggs that are sold in the state. In terms of what I heard about Prop 12 at the USMEF conference, there's a lot of uncertainty about how the law would be implemented. At that time, they were awaiting a new FAQ document from the California Department of Food and Agriculture, and this has since been released. This is available online, and to be honest, it wasn't as insightful as I thought it might be, but there seems to be some progress. Maybe there's more to come there. One of the big topics of discussion at USMEF regarding Prop 12 was how California was planning to handle products that were being shipped through California to the West Coast ports, Long Beach, Los Angeles, things like that. There is a lot of U.S. Pork product, especially, that gets shipped internationally through those ports. My understanding, based on the discussion at the conference, was that there will be some extra paperwork for pork that is shipped through California but not sold in California, but that the exact Prop 12 restrictions won't apply to that pork that is shipped through California. So what happens if the pork gets stuck in port due to port labor contract issues? I guess we'll see how that one unfolds. It's hard to say what's going to happen in that very special case ahead of time.
Yeah, as the leading pork producer in the country, Iowa, both of those issues are key for Iowa farmers. So we're glad that you were able to get an update and bring that information to us. I'm sure those will continue to be issues as we go forward here for quite some time. What are some other key economic trends and challenges that you're watching that impact Iowa's farmers and the ag economy in general?
I'm going to stick with the hog market for just a little bit longer because returns in the Iowa hog market have just been absolutely abysmal for going on a year straight. Lee Schultz, my former research advisor at Iowa State, maintains estimates for returns to hog feeding, and his estimates show that Iowa feeder to finish producers have, on average, experienced 12 straight months of negative margins. It's been a rough streak for Iowa's hog producers. Most recently, the April 2023 estimate was a loss of $50 per head, and so it's just a really big negative figure for any Iowa farmer out there. So this will drive continued contraction in the industry and breeding stock liquidation, which is already well underway. A second issue I've been tracking is drought in the state and in the region more broadly. Last week's drought monitor indicated that more than 90% of the state of Iowa is registering now as abnormally dry or worse. This was up from 57% just a week before that. Definitely something to keep an eye on. Some parts of the state are in what feels like a 3 to 4 year drought. And, with La Nina abating, shifting into a neutral or even an El Nino cycle, there was some hope that a switch was going to flip and things were going to get better. It seems like that hasn't happened in the way that some folks thought based on how much snow was falling out west this winter. Some folks thought based on long-term forecasts. So watching that drought and how that impacts corn production in the state of Iowa and in the Corn Belt more broadly, and how that impacts corn prices is something that I'm watching pretty closely. Enough with the bad news, though. If there is a bright spot in the Iowa ag market right now, it is cattle markets, which have really taken off in recent weeks due to tight supplies. Now, those tight supplies are due to those years of drought that I have mentioned, but we are finally on the downward portion of the cattle cycle, which was delayed a year or two due to COVID. And so as a whole, fed cattle producers are experiencing some of the best margins that they've experienced in years. So if there is a bright spot to be found in the Iowa ag market, it is cattle markets. Iowa is the fourth largest producer of fed cattle in the country. We have the fourth largest cattle on feed inventory in terms of the states. So some good news there. And hopefully other, sort of negative looking things turn around as well.
At the top of the podcast, Christopher, you mentioned that this month you're leading a group of Farm Bureau members on a market study tour to England and Scotland. What's the purpose of this kind of tour, and what are some specific issues that will be the primary focus of the trip?
Yeah, so the primary goal as a market study tour is, sort of as the name says, to study the UK agricultural economy. We're particularly interested in studying the motivations for Brexit, which was the British exit from the European Union, and how this Brexit has impacted the agricultural community in the United Kingdom. The vote was in 2016, but there was some delay, and the actual exit, the leaving of the EU, wasn't finalized until 2020. So there are many ways that this exit will impact the UK economy and the agricultural economy specifically. They're still being ironed out. We are sort of watching in real time as the UK government figures out how they're going to handle various issues. In terms of the tour itself, we'll fly into London and then work our way through the English countryside, sort of on the eastern side of the country, through the drier grain production region, before ending up in Scotland. As we go, we'll meet with several agricultural producer groups. We'll meet with some UK government officials. We'll also get to go on several farm tours. And we're excited to hear what the various groups and the various farmers that we meet with have to say about this Brexit issue. The different areas of the UK tended to vote differently on this subject. And so as we kind of do a tour through a good chunk of the ag production in the country, we're excited to hear what different people have to say. And then finally, we currently don't have a trade deal with the United Kingdom. As the United States, we don't. And though negotiations were started for a trade deal during the last months of the Trump administration, things kind of petered out, nothing materialized. I'm personally looking forward to discussions about future trade agreements between the United States and the United Kingdom, and we hope to learn about what could be the obstacles to such a trade agreement, but also the various opportunities that present themselves. And we think that talking to different groups along the way is going to paint a really nice picture of what those hangups could be, but also what those areas for mutually beneficial exchange could be in any such agreement.
Sounds like a very all-encompassing and knowledge-based trip. So we'll look forward to getting a report from you when you get back, and maybe catch up with some of the members also participating in the trip. But why is it important for farmers to take advantage of learning opportunities like the Market Study Tour and understand agriculture in other countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you want to truly understand agriculture in any country, whether that's the United States or the UK, you have to get out into the countryside. Most Americans who go to the UK, and I'm guilty of this myself, never make it out of London or never make it out of Edinburgh. It's kind of like how folks from other countries who, if they've been to the United States, they've been to New York City or they've been to LA. That doesn't really give you an indication of what agriculture is like in the United States. If you want to learn about ag, you have to get out into the countryside. You have to get out into the Midwest or some other agricultural production region. So I think that it is really important for Iowa farmers who want to learn about agricultural production practices and how they vary, and the various challenges faced by agricultural producers internationally. And in this case, the UK, you have to visit there. You have to talk to farmers. You have to, go to the equivalent of the local coffee shop, right? Maybe in the UK it'll be the local tea spot, right? And you have to talk to the folks, and you have to find out what's going on and what is impacting their production, what is impacting the prices they receive. And you can't do that unless you really just get out into the fields, you get your hands dirty, you get your boots dirty, you have conversation with these like-minded folk, and you can just really learn from that.
Thanks, Dr. Pudenz, and it's great to have you as part of the Iowa Farm Bureau team. As you can hear, Dr. Pudenz is off to a quick start, and it will be interesting to see what he uncovers in terms of opportunities and challenges during that market study tour of the UK. You can follow along with that UK tour on Iowa Farm Bureau's Facebook and Instagram pages, where we'll be sharing photos and brief takeaways from the tour. We'll also have full recaps in the Spokesman newspaper and on this podcast when the group returns home to Iowa. Next up are two Central Iowa farmers who have developed a strong reputation for their first-hand conservation knowledge. Jeremy Gustafson, a Boone County farmer, and Doug Adams, a Humboldt County farmer and soil conservation technician with NRCS, were both panelists discussing soil health during Iowa State University's 95th annual Soil Management and Land Valuation Conference, held May 17th in Ames. Afterwards, Spokesman reporter Bob Bion had a chance to talk to both Jeremy and Doug about the best conservation advice they could offer other farmers. So we'll start with Jeremy Gustafson, who hopped on a call with Bob late last month.
So let's visit a little about conservation, soil organic matter, and soil health. But let's start with a little bit about your farming operation and what it all includes.
Well, we're a family farm. We're located in Boone County, right in the middle of the state. We got about 1,500 acres. We rotate corn and soybeans. We do quite a bit of cover crops on our farms. We also do a lot of strip till on our farm.
You've been heavily involved in conservation measures. When did you first become involved, and what have you implemented over the years?
We've always been interested in conservation practices on our farm, but I suppose the thing that really got us going was back in the early 2000s when the CSP program came out. We thought that was an opportunity for us to really dive into more conservation on our farm and have a little help along the way from the NRCS in guiding us a little bit. And then also on the monetary side, being able to help us with some funding to change the equipment that we have at the farm, and help us get kickstarted into that. So I'd say, we've been doing this for about 15 years, and we've evolved over it from just starting out as a few acres to every year adding a little bit more and getting a little more confident in what we're doing and trying and expanding acres every year and expanding the different practices we're trying.
Would you mind expanding a little bit on some of the practices that you have employed?
Well, when we started out, we wanted to try cover crops. We've seen the value that people from other parts of the United States were having and how they were working them in their system, but there wasn't a lot of people at that time in Iowa that were using cover crops in my area. So we started out pretty small when we first started, and I think it was as simple as, getting an old drill out and drilling some cereal rye in the fall on corn stalks. I've wore out a couple drills now. So we started with that. We experimented with some oats too, and just really dipped our toe into the water to see what happened. We had good results. We learned a lot along the way. We learned some do's and don'ts, and that's what I try to tell when I talk to people, try to give them my experiences of what we've done and what has and hasn't worked. When we first started, we didn't want much cover crop out there. We wanted to keep it small, not real growthy. We wanted to be easy to terminate, and now we've gone to the point of almost the exact opposite. We want it big. We want it tall. We want a lot of biomass. We're not worried at all about planting through it. And this is mainly where we're going to put our soybeans and using cereal rye. We've had really good success with that. And then on the corn side, we've dabbled a little bit in cover crops, but our go-to on corn right now is mainly doing strip tillage. And we try to do that in the fall. It doesn't always happen in the fall, but we try. And then we try to concentrate our nutrients in that zone of the strip till and plant right over top of that. And we have tried some oats, and we've tried some camelina and different things like that in front of corn. We're still experimenting, trying to find what we can do and what is successful year in and year out on that. So we haven't quite got that all figured out on the corn side yet.
So what benefits have you seen most? At the conference, you spoke about limiting soil erosion in particular and the benefits of increased water infiltration.
When we first started, everybody's the cheerleader for erosion control. And until you can really see that on your farm and see that the soil is staying right where it's supposed to and not moving, that's the biggest eye catcher you can see. And when we see our soils, and especially when we get them into that condition with using cover crops where they're more stable and the aggregates are bigger, we can strip till that every other year, and we're not seeing a lot of soil movement even on our strips. And that just makes me happy that we don't have to go out. And there is, we do have weather extremes where you get a 3 or 4 inch rain, and we do have to go out and touch up sometimes. But my goal, once we strip till that, is just to go out in the spring and plant into that. And when we see rainfall, I want that rainfall to stay on my farm, because everybody knows that, maybe at the end of the year it all averages out, but everything's extreme anymore. We get a long period of dry, we get a bunch of rain. We don't ever get them all day rains anymore every week. It just seems like when you have an opportunity to get a raindrop on your farm, you need to hold it there for later. And that's what we're seeing. The water infiltration, it's night and day compared to some of my neighbors. Usually we can go out in our fields. I won't say every time, but most times we're can be out there before our neighbors, just because the water infiltrates in and we have cover on the soil and there's not a lot of muddy areas. So the soil stability and the water infiltration, that's the two main things. We're seeing a lot of also, especially this year, we've noticed our weed pressure is a lot less where we're running cover crops. We're doing a lot where we're not using pre's anymore or cutting way back on pre's. I still use chemicals, but we're sort of situating them a little differently now. And we don't see much for broadleaf weed pressure where we're running that cereal rye. We'll still get a little grass here and there, but the broadleafs are few and far between if we can keep a nice cereal rye cover crop before our soybeans.
So you also mentioned an aha moment that you had. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. We were into soil health a little bit, and that was the buzzword, and we were doing cover crops, and I walk my fields quite a bit, and I carry a spade, and we dig and look, and I've seen the rainfall simulator many times, and I urge any farmer that hasn't seen that to just go on YouTube and find somebody doing that. And for those of you that haven't seen them, they go out into a field and they cut a couple inch soil profile and they lay it in pans, and then they simulate the rain on it. And you watch it, and they're catching the surface runoff, and then they also catch the internal runoff, or what would be coming through your tile line or perforating through the soil. And that's all well and good, and you can see it, and it makes sense. But what got me was we were having a field day here at our farm, and the NRCS agent, and I can't remember his name now, but he took that pan when we were all done, and my kids had been playing in the dirt. The sample that he had was worked ground. I mean, it was just like it was in your garden. It was nice and loose. I mean, you could pick it up and drop it. I mean, it was easy to play with. He took that and flipped it over quickly, and I believe it was an inch or an inch and a half rain that we just simulated, and the water had only gone into that soil a quarter inch before sealing off. So there's no pore space in work ground. Even though you can work ground to dry it out, when you get a rain on it, it wants to seal over when it's worked because of all the small particles. So that was my aha moment. When you're looking at that and you're like, I just got an inch of rain and I maybe benefited a quarter inch of it. 3/4 of the inch of the rain ran off down the river and will never come back to my farm again, and probably taking nutrients and some of my soil with it. So that's where we've seen is just that rainfall simulator. It's eye-opening when they do that. And I don't know who the first person ever was that figured that out, but I would like to shake his hand.
You also spoke about kind of your overall general farming philosophy with building revenue while also viewing environmental stewardship as very important, kind of a partnership in tandem. Can you expand a little bit on that?
Well, so the first obvious thing is we're cutting trips across the field. So how we're doing our cereal rye right now is in partnership with a neighbor who has a vertical tillage machine with a Montag box on it. That is our one trip in the fall after harvest. We're running that vertical tillage machine across our corn stalks. He's putting down the cereal rye. We're seeding that in. There's still quite a bit of corn stalks on top. You really can't tell he'd been out there. And that's my full fall tillage. And I come back in the spring and I will plant directly into that with my planter. I've replaced or eliminated the disc chisel, and we don't do any field cultivating in the spring. So in eliminating those two fuel consumption practices right there, I'm saving money. And then I'll reinvest that money in the cover crop seed, and then possibly, if you're not planning on burning down, if you were going to do tillage, you wouldn't burn down in the spring, a little bit into that chemical program. And then the other part of it is I try to put my fertilizer on multiple times a year, and I try to put it timely so the crop is utilizing it. So like my nitrogen, we don't put any nitrogen on pre-plant. It's all right at planting or during the season. So I can cut my nitrogen rates down, which in turn saves me money in the end because I'm not wasting any. My efficiency is very high. So that's what we try to do. And then just overall, the yields that we can pull help too in the end, because we're not necessarily getting higher yields, but we're more consistent on our yields year in and year out.
Any challenges that you've seen over the years that you've had to overcome?
Well, when we started, you couldn't just look across the fence and see what the neighbor was doing because nobody else was in our area was doing these practices. So I found out right away that social media was a good place to get information, maybe not perfect information for your area, but to be able to see what other people are doing. So I started watching YouTube videos. I'm on Twitter. I don't put out a lot of information, but I follow a lot of other farmers that are farming similarly to how I am. And it's great to be able to have a network like that. So a normal farmer, you'd say the coffee shop or the co-op or something like that, you could talk to like-minded farmers. This is how I do it. Another outlet that has worked really well for me is Practical Farmers of Iowa. It's a farmer-led group based out of Ames, and they do a lot of research. I've done quite a bit of research with them, and it's all farmer-led stuff. So we've done research on early and late termination of cereal rye with soybeans and how it affects yield, and all sorts of stuff like that on cover crops. And we've always come out with basically there's no statistical difference if you terminate rye early, late. Soybeans don't really care. That's one thing there. Some of the early problems was we were worried about that growth. So we had really early on, we had a couple fields that we thought were getting just too big too fast. So we went out and sprayed them, got them killed, and then we had 10 days of rain. You don't want that, because then all of a sudden that green lush cover crop turns into a yellow brown paper, and your planter don't want to go through that. And that's when we learned that we always want to plant green. If the plant's green, no matter if it's 3 inches tall or 3 foot tall, the planter will go through it. So that was one of the major mistakes we made that I try to tell everybody is, even if it's getting out of hand and it's raining for 2 weeks, let it grow. It's sucking moisture out of the ground for you. It's helping dry out. It's giving you structure. You'll be able to get out there and plant as soon as it quits raining and dries off for a day or two. It's helping you out there. And then kill it after you plant it, or the day you're planting it. So that was one of our big uh-oh moments, I guess you would say. So, but we've learned a lot, and talking with other people that are doing it, we get more comfortable. And I've taken on selling cover crops now with our seed business. So I get a lot of phone calls from guys that are just starting out, and they're worried, man, I got to do something. This is getting away from me. And you say, well, how tall is your rye right now? Well, it's 6 inches tall. Well, it ain't got away from you yet then. But it's something different you're not used to seeing, because if you had a 6-inch weed out there, you'd be going crazy. We got to get that worked in. We got to get it sprayed. Really, the rye is not competing with the soybean at all in that aspect. And then it's interesting to see, and I haven't done any on my farm personally, but I've seen some other research where guys are taking the biomass samples of the rye without any fertilizer applied and being able to show that the rye is releasing or breaking loose more nutrients in the soil. And then when that dies, it gives it back to your existing crop that you got growing out there. So you are, through the soil health aspect, opening up your fertilizer that might not be accessible to your corn and soybeans by having a third crop out there with different acids that it's giving off.
How about some future plans you hope to implement and experiment with?
We're always looking to try new things. I would like to try to find a good cover in our area that I can grow before corn that doesn't compete with corn. And some of the farmers I know are using rye, but I just tend to stay away from rye because it's a grass just like corn. I want to get my covers to last longer and grow longer into the season while not affecting my yield on my cash crop. So we're looking into some ways of possibly down the road figuring out how to, instead of broadcast the whole field, put your cover crops more into zones or rows where you could plant your cash crop in between them, is something we looked at. And I feel like we're doing a lot on our farm until I get on Twitter or see something on YouTube, and there's guys doing stuff that makes me envious. Sometimes it's just their growing season. They got longer time to do things. I would love to figure out a way to grow more nitrogen from my corn. But in Iowa, it seems like our window is pretty small right now. So trying to get a clover or even alfalfa or something like that interseeded in between, there's not enough time in our growing conditions right now.
And lastly, how about some advice for that farmer who hasn't yet taken the leap and is considering implementing some conservation measures like cover crops or no-till?
Well, I think the first thing is start small. Don't ever go out and do all your acres. Take an 80 or a 40 and split it in half and do cover crops on part of it for a couple of years and watch that soil and see if it changes compared to the rest of the farm. Or if you have two farms that are close to each other, do a few practices like cover crops or no-till or even strip till. There's guys that do custom strip till, and there's some co-ops that have machines too. If you want to try it, don't be afraid to ask somebody that's your neighbor. Try to find somebody in your area that is doing some of these things and use him as a mentor, use him as somebody you can ask. Most of the guys that I know that are into soil health are very open with what they're doing and are willing to talk and give you advice or talk to you about what their chemical program is, or have we done something different with our fertility. Those would be the two major things. And the other part is, find a group like PFI or go into your NRCS office. Find a group like that that's promoting it. There is some money out there for first-time people to help them transition. I know NRCS has some. PFI has some private money that you can put on top of that. There's really some great cost share opportunities right now for guys that want to get started into cover crops. And that's something that I think we forget about sometimes, is there are groups like NRCS that are out there that have knowledgeable people working there that can help you get started, or they're the ones that know who's doing it in your county and can say, call this person or call this person. And I'm a commissioner on our soil and water in Boone County. I know we have several in our county now that are pretty active into doing cover crops on that scale. And you can call any of those people up and they're going to talk to you for an hour. So that would be the main thing. Start small and find somebody else that's doing something that you're interested in doing.
We appreciate you sharing those insights, Jeremy. You know, we've always heard that farmers often learn best by tapping into the knowledge and experience of their peers. So we hope you picked up a couple of things from Jeremy that you can apply to your own situation. And with that in mind, let's bring on another farmer, Doug Adams, to share his firsthand experience. Doug works as a soil conservation technician for NRCS, and he farms in north central Iowa. Once again, here's Spokesman reporter Bob Beyond.
Let's start with a little bit about your farming operation, where you are located, and your work with NRCS.
Yeah, so our home farm here, we're located in southwest Humboldt County. So we farm pretty much between Humboldt, Gilmore City, Clare, and Badger. So just into the northern part of Webster County as well. And I'm the sixth generation on our home farm here. And for NRCS, I work out of the Fort Dodge office now. I've been from the Humboldt office for many years, but currently we're based out of the Fort Dodge office, and we cover Boone, Greene, Calhoun, and Webster counties.
So when and why did you get into conservation practices?
So I started my farming career in 1993, the year I graduated from high school. And all along, I was always experimenting with different practices. One of my 8th grade science fair projects was actually looking at tillage and how soybeans emerged. So we looked at plowed, chisel plowed, and no-till conditions. And looking back now, it's amazing how that in 8th grade kind of has shaped my whole career.
What types of practices do you implement on your farm currently?
Like I said, I started farming in 93, and then in the year 2000, I converted from conventional farm to no-till farming. No-till as well as strip till. We also added cover crops then in 2012.
Go ahead and maybe expand a little bit on each of those individually, those practices that you've implemented.
So with our no-till, we no-till our soybeans into corn stalks. And then for strip till, we strip till bean stubble, which will then be planted to corn. And on all of those acres, I generally try to put cover crops down on. Most of my cover crops are cereal rye based. I've also done some mixes. I've tried some winter wheat, oats, and a few other species thrown in the mix just to see how things work.
So over the years, what types of benefits have you seen from the conservation practices?
So for me, why I started doing no-till was because when it would rain, we would see all of the runoff come down into our potholes and flood those areas out. And I thought, boy, if I could just get that raindrop to soak in on the hilltop where it falls rather than running off into the low ground, I'd be much better off, because the high hilltops usually dry out in the summertime. And if the low ground drowns out, we're having to replant that, and that's not good for the bottom line. So that's when I decided to try strip till and no-till.
Can you expand on that a little bit as far as your strip till and no-till practices and what you're seeing as far as benefits?
So some of the benefits I see are improved water infiltration, reduced erosion, and then we're also seeing a lot more biological activity in the soil. So one of the things when I'm out this time of year checking germination or seed placement, I'm usually finding worms as much as I am finding the seed in my furrow. So if you go out on a conventional tilled field, you typically don't find many worms. But now that I've been doing this for about 10, 15 years, I'm finding a lot more worms and other things in my fields. Another benefit that I see of the cover crops are I see a lot more wildlife. So this morning when I was out planting some soybeans, there's quite a few deer out in the field, as well as doves and pheasants. So those are the main species we see up here. And a lot of times I'm scaring pheasants off in nests because when we're planting into our cover crop, it's about knee high right now. And those pheasants are finding that for nesting habitat.
Would you mind expanding a little bit on the earthworms? I've heard that discussed quite a bit and their benefits to the soil.
Yeah, so once I got into the no-till system, it takes probably 3 to 5 years, a little bit shorter if you can add cover crops when you start. So every new farm, when I rent a new farm or buy a new farm, the first thing I do after the previous owner takes the crop off is I like to get a cover crop out there, and then I start my no-till right away in the spring. So our cover crops get applied with either the plane or a drill. But the worms, when I walk out into the fields that have been longer term no-till, the worm middens, they're called, it's like a little cap on their house. You can pull the little straw pile off, and there's typically the hole for the earthworm. And what happens is those earthworms don't really want to leave that hole, and they reach out and they grab residue and pull it down into their hole or cover their hole with it. And for me, that's where the water really starts to infiltrate, because you've got a hole about the size of a pencil for water to get down into your subsoil, into your root zone where your crop's roots are.
So at the conference, you talked a little bit about the financial side of it, cost share opportunities. That's been one of the stumbling blocks for farmers to consider conservation measures. What types of cost share programs are available for farmers to help out?
So at the NRCS office, the first thing I like to try to get farmers to sign up for is our state cost share programs through the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. And that's a real easy program that we can get people into. There's the water quality initiatives, or the WQI fund as well. And those typically pay $15 to $25 per acre. First-time users get first chance at most of those programs. And then if you're coming back for a second chance or third, you're at a lower payment rate. But those payment rates will almost cover most of the cost of the seed and application of your cover crop. Some of the other programs we have, of course, is EQIP and CSP. So once farmers have started using the state cost share and they say, hey, this is something that I'd like to adopt over more acres or for a longer period of time, we'll get them enrolled into the EQIP program. And that can be a 3 to 5 year program. And then after that, typically we step them up into the CSP program, the Conservation Stewardship Program.
And how best to access these programs? Do they go to their local NRCS office?
Yeah, that's right. Every county in the state will have an NRCS office. It's typically co-located with the Farm Service Agency. So as farmers are probably finishing up planting, they're going to be going into the office to certify their crops. So they could stop in and chat with the NRCS office while they're waiting for FSA to finish some of their paperwork. And the NRCS office can talk to you quite a bit about the different cost share opportunities, as well as other soil health benefits.
And lastly, what advice would you give to a farmer now considering implementing either cover crops or no-till, or developing buffer strips or wetlands?
Well, some of the advice I would give is, if you're going to start doing no-till, I think the best way to step into it would be to no-till soybeans into corn stalks. That seems to be one of the best ways to get started. Cover crops, I would suggest adding cereal rye into that cornfield and then planting your soybeans into that cereal rye cover crop. To me, those are the two easy ways to get involved. As for buffer strips, waterways, talk to your NRCS office, discuss with them your goals, and look at different areas of your farms and point out areas that you may have erosion concerns. So those are great areas to focus on.
Thanks, Doug. What's great about a topic like conservation is that farmers really do have a wealth of expertise to tap into across the entire state. Farmers like Doug and Jeremy aren't just trying out these practices on their own farms and then keeping that knowledge for themselves. They're eager to share what they're learning with you and other farmers. If you're interested in learning more about the conservation practices your peers are trying and seeing the impact that they're having, I'd recommend you check out conservationcountsiowa.com. The site includes examples of farmers' conservation work in each region of the state, a list of field days and other learning events, and a series of videos and infographics that show the impact Iowa's conservation efforts are having on soil health and water quality protection. Again, that website is conservationcountsiowa.com. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you learned something new and that you'll join us for the next episode on July 3rd. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau. And thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.